Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caitlin Donaldson. I'm the curator for the Lorain Historical Society. Thank you everyone who is joining us here live today, November 17th, 2020, for our last History from Home Zoom third Tuesday of the month presentation for the year. Before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Craig Semsel, I have a few announcements to make. If you're joining us today, then you know this program is free for everyone. And if you enjoy the program and are interested in supporting the Lorain Historical Society, please consider becoming a member, renewing your membership early, or donating to our annual appeal. Any support is appreciated. Our museum did reopen for tours in August, and we are following social distancing guidelines. Along with our museum opening, so has our gift shop. Please keep our gift shop in mind this holiday season. We have a wonderful selection of locally made and Lorain-themed gifts. We do not have an online gift shop, but we are taking phone orders. We will be planning next year's programming this December and January, so stay tuned. Anyone can sign up for our e-news by emailing info@lorainhistory.org to stay up to date on all of our offerings. And now, to introduce our program for this afternoon, Dr. Craig Semsel is a professor of history at Lorain County Community College. In addition to teaching, he has volunteered countless hours for the Historical Society, especially researching and compiling the history of World War I veterans from Lorain. His research has revealed countless discoveries on where Lorainites served and what action they saw. He graciously agreed to present again his research on Lorain's veterans from World War I. He first presented this during our 100th anniversary of World War I commemoration a couple years ago. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Craig Semsel. I'll turn this all over to you.
Okay, is the screen up?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, just like to add my welcome and thank all of you who have joined us and are looking at the program. Be presenting Lorain over there, Lorain Army veterans from the Great War. This is just the Army veterans. This does not include those who fought in the Marine Corps or the Navy or the Coast Guard. And there were Lorain veterans who fought in those branches of the service as well. As a matter of fact, Lorain veterans served in just about every capacity you could possibly think of. If there was a job to do during the Great War, there was at least one person from Lorain doing it. Just give you a little bit of a background where this information came from. This came from the official roster of Great War veterans. The state of Ohio compiled a list of every Ohioan who had served during the Great War during the 1920s. Most of the volumes listing these veterans would be published in 1926. Though some of the later volumes, including one that had error corrections and such in it, were published later in the 20s and finally appeared, the final volume appeared in 1929. So let's just take a look at some general figures that I can tell you about the veterans. Okay, let's get that moving. Okay. Lorain Army veterans. To begin with, 1,160 Lorain citizens fought in the Great War. Of these, 1,156 were men, and of those, 1,114 were white, 42 were African American. 4 obviously were women, and they served as nurses during the Great War. What else can we tell you? Totally, the United States deployed something like 4.8 million men and women to fight in the war. Deployed from Lorain, 582 Lorain citizens went overseas. 257 were engaged in combat. Let's see. Of those who fought, 53 were wounded in action. 9 were killed in action. 26 died from influenza. Hard to believe, but 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago now, we were in the grips of another pandemic, a pandemic that would wind up killing twice the number of people who died in combat during World War I. So that's a rather significant figure there. 5 would die from other causes. Nationally, just looking at total U.S. casualties, 117,500 U.S. soldiers would die. Of those, 53,400 would die in combat, 64,100 would die of other causes. And I will give you the exact number for a number of U.S. people who died from the flu a little later on. Approximately, and these are sketchy figures, about 204,000 American troops were wounded during the war. What else can we tell you about these veterans? Okay, just got to remember to press the right button, dang on it. 363 were foreign born. They were born someplace other than the United States. 797 were born in the United States. 454 were Ohio natives, and 197 were Lorain natives. They were born in Lorain and had lived their entire lives in Lorain until they went to fight in the war. Just some general broad figures, some national figures, so that we have an idea of where Lorain fit in the schema of things. Your typical World War I soldier would be between the ages of 17 and 22 years of age. Interestingly enough, most Lorain veterans appear to be older than the typical range. I think the average age for Lorain was somewhere around 24 years, and we will see a few examples of this. Most U.S. soldiers had little more than a 6th grade education. 1 in 4 U.S. soldiers was illiterate. 1 in 5 were immigrants. Many of them, most of those born in Europe. So they were born in Europe, came to the United States, settled somewhere in the U.S., and then went back to fight in Europe. And then approximately 1 in 10 were African American, just some general statistics. I have a number of Lorain veterans to share with you today, just describe their career, what they saw, and just a few that I've highlighted because 1, we've got pictures of them, and 2, because of the experience they had. It enables us to get a little idea of what these people experienced. And again, if there was something going on during the Great War, there was somebody from Lorain who was involved in it. I think one of the biggest shocks that I had doing the research was I encountered a military unit I didn't even know about, actually several units. They were called spruce squadrons. And literally what these people were basically lumberjacks or forestry employees. They were literally sent in the forest looking for wood that would be suitable for aircraft production. The airplane was a very new vehicle during the Great War. It was a weapons platform that wasn't fully appreciated during the war. And nobody really knew how to build large quantities of aircraft. And the U.S. Army in particular had a problem with quality control. So much of they actually created special military units, spruce squadrons, that would literally go into the forest to find those materials. Spruce was the name given to the squadrons because they were literally, spruce was one of the woods that was most sought after by aircraft manufacturers. Not going to be sharing any specific Lorain spruce soldiers today, but I just thought I would mention that. That really surprised me as I was doing my research. Okay, this gentleman is Andrew L. MATYSIAK. He was born in Jobs, Ohio. When he lived in Lorain, his address was 1720 Long Avenue at the time. And he was 24 years, 2 months old when he entered service. So he is older than the national average for veterans. Interestingly enough, he left school after the 6th grade, right dead on the average for U.S. Veterans. Why did he leave? The schooling at that age? Because he went into the coal mines because, you know, when you're young, you're tinier, you're smaller, and he was able to fit in parts of the coal mines, I guess, around jobs that full-sized adults could not. Despite his lack of formal education, Andrew MATYSIAK, I've been told, was an avid reader for his entire life. He really enjoyed sitting down with a good book and reading it from cover to cover. Let's see, what else can we tell you? Okay, the battles in which Mr. MATYSIAK fought. I've included him here because he has fought in a remarkable number of battles. He would enter service on December 5, 1917, and he would deploy overseas during the spring of 1918. If you take a look at some of his early letters, he just general letters describing what was going on. He was actually deployed around New Orleans for the winter, which isn't a bad place to be. And this is what he had to say when we look at some of his earlier letters. We're on guard up at the river now, and this is some town. We're staying in a nice bungalow. This is some house, an old Southern home, and I like it up here. We're on guard 4 hours on and 8 hours and 8 hours off, and that is not so bad. Later on, he wrote to his brother from New Orleans, "Hell, kid, we play ball every day. We got some good teams, and we've won every game so far. We are having a good time. I and my pal was down to some of the parks, and they surely have some parks. Roses and flowers are in blossom, and I believe it is surely nice. The South is the only place in the winter." Boy, we needed somebody from over 100 years ago to tell us that. Nothing changes. We get pretty good eats now, and they treat us fine. Tell mother not to worry about me, for I'm getting on nicely. I go to church every Sunday, so I'm getting good. Well, kid, the river's pretty high, so I think we'll have to guard the levee. Then he deploys to France, and starting in May of 1918, his letters start to reflect what he's about to see. I quote, "We received our gas masks and are getting our helmets and are receiving a fine pair of wrapped leggings for dress. The color is olive drab. We're going to church tomorrow, and we go every Sunday. We just have to go downstairs, and then we're in church. Just as soon as we lick the Kaiser, we'll come swinging the stars and stripes forever. We boys in France like to hear from home, and also from our neighbors." Then a little later in May of 1918, he wrote, "It is warm over here, and we're having fine weather. It is beautiful country over here. Everything has flowers over here, and it looks grand. From your loving son, Andrew. Goodbye. Answer soon. I'm always glad to hear from home, and also from Lorain." Letters kind of thin out after that because Mr. MATYSIAK was a very busy individual. Look at the battles that he fought in. He was at Noyon-Montdidier. He was at the Aisne-Marne battle. He fought at Saint-Mihiel, or Mihiel. I don't know how to pronounce that one. Finally, he was at the Meuse River-Argonne forest. That was the granddaddy of them all. It was the largest campaign involving American troops. Also notice that his record includes something called the defensive sector. Any battle or skirmish or encounter with the enemy that was not part of a large formal battle or campaign was simply grouped collectively under the heading defensive sector in the official roster. Apparently, MATYSIAK was in several of these skirmishes. Exactly what their nature was, exactly what his role in these encounters were, is uncertain. We just know that he was in something that was too small to be grouped with a major battle or campaign. So Noyon-Montdidier, what did he see at that battle? This battle was fought in June of 1918. There is the German General Erich von Ludendorff. He conducted 4 major offensives during the spring of 1918, and Noyon-Montdidier was the 4th and final of these. He was trying to link a pair of salients that the German army had punched through Allied lines. He had 2 salients, and he wanted to try to link them up. The men that he used were General Oskar von Hüttier, who is on the left, and then General Max von Behn from the 7th Army on the right. They would run up against 2 French generals, General Georges Humbert and General Charles Mangin. These were the 2 that would wind up going head to head. And in the battle, basically, 1 German unit would actually make it, would actually make to its objective. The other was not able to do anything. So it was only halfway successful. This is actually a colorized photograph of German troops advancing during the Battle of Noyon-Montdidier. And these are French troops as part of the counter-assault. The German assault began on the 9th of June, 1918, and 2 days later, the French counter began. There were US troops with this counteroffensive, and that is where Mr. MATYSIAK would have been. The Germans were pushed back. In fact, by the 13th of June, they'd been pushed all the way back to their starting positions. The Battle of Aisne-Marne was fought in over the 15th of July into the 6th of August, 1918. The Germans would attack from eastern and western positions. There's one of the generals, General Max von Behn. And there is the Aisne-Marne offensive. The Germans were only about halfway successful, and one of the reasons they were only half successful was the size of the counter-assault. The East offensive launched by the Germans failed. It stalled during the battle, but the West offensive succeeded. It reached the Marne River, and it actually crossed the river and established a small beachhead before the French were able to launch their counteroffensive. Again, the German offensives began on the 15th of July, and the Allies were able to counter 3 days later on the 18th. This is French Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch. He would use 4 French armies, and he had the support of 8 U.S. Army divisions in trying to push the Germans back. This is a picture showing you Foch's plans, and you can see the 4 different army groups he was using. They're numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. And again, U.S. troops were part of they were part of the first, I think they were a part of each of these 4 offensives. Foch also had access to British and Italian divisions, 350 Allied tanks. Ludendorff was pushed back Ludendorff's men were pushed back rather quickly, and Foch's counteroffensive was rather successful. On the 2nd of August, Foch was able to liberate Soissons, which was a French, either a small city or a large town. You can see from this image that much of the old part of the city was largely destroyed. Okay, Saint-Mihiel was fought on 2 days, on the 12th and 13th of September, 1918. This was another battle MATYSIAK was in. It is significant because this was the first major independent U.S. action fought during the Great War. On the 30th of August, the U.S. First Army was ready for independent action and would deploy south of Verdun and Saint-Mihiel. On the 11th of September, the Germans, who were getting rather battered, started to withdraw. And as they started to withdraw, General Pershing would pounce. That's what John J. Pershing looked like. And this shows you how successful his attack was. In the shaded area, you can see the bulge or salient that the Germans had punched into the Allied lines. And basically, by September 16th, General Pershing had actually pushed this bulge all the way back to the front line. You can see where it's marked on September 16th. A rather successful counteroffensive. These are U.S. troops on maneuver during the battle. And for all we know, Mr. MATYSIAK may be somewhere in that photograph. These are U.S. troops that have taken up a position along a road. Perhaps they're anticipating the enemy to appear. Perhaps they have word or have actually seen something. These are U.S. troops taking advantage of French tanks. These are small light tanks. It would take 2 men to operate, one driving, and you can see the forward hatches open to give the driver a better view. And then there's a second man who is inside the turret of the tank, operating the tank's what appears to be a machine gun or some light caliber weapon. There's a tank during Saint-Mihiel showing off its ability to handle uneven terrain. I can't imagine what the ride must have been like inside one of those. And this is a U.S. artillery position during the battle. We know that MATYSIAK was engaged in ammunition handling and was in ammunition supply trains during these battles. So it is quite possible that this was an emplacement that he may have visited or have encountered. Okay, what can we tell you about the battle's aftermath? Again, our first major U.S. action, the U.S. would sustain 7,000 casualties. That is 7,000 men either killed or wounded. The Germans would suffer 5,000 casualties. We would capture 466 German guns, but far more significant is the following figure. 13,000 German troops were captured. And here you can see some German prisoners of war being tended to by Allied medics following the battle. So that's a rather significant victory. Then came the Meuse River-Argonne forest offensive. This was by far the largest battle involving, or a campaign rather, involving U.S. troops. The battle began on the 26th of September, 1918, and would continue all the way up to the signing of the armistice on the 11th of November, 1918. So that's a pretty long series of battles. This is a map showing you the Allied attacks that started on September 26th. If you follow the front line all the way down near the bottom right of the map, you'll see Saint-Mihiel and above it Verdun, And above Verdun, you'll see a shaded area. That is where the Americans were going to be deployed, and they would be fighting their way through the Argonne forest. This was going to be a very difficult task for U.S. troops. To begin with, the terrain was absolutely horrific. There were hills, dense woods, steep valleys. To make matters worse, the Germans had been fortifying this since 1915 and had built fortifications that were some 12 miles in depth. If that isn't enough, the US had 600,000 troops heading into the area, and there were no railroads and only 3 minor roadways in the entire area. So this was a remarkably difficult offensive to launch. Here we can see a little bit of the initial progress that was made. The French to the 1st of October had advanced 9 miles. The US was able to advance about 5 miles along the Meuse River, but after 5 days, or actually, about 5 days of fighting, the US had only penetrated about 2 miles into the Argonne forest. Just to give you an idea how difficult all of that terrain was. This is a classic image of a US machine gun crew taken in the forest. You can see how the trees have been absolutely obliterated by all of the artillery. During the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of October, the US would pause for reinforcements. And during this time, Mr. MATYSIAK is finally able to write home. Just before his first letter got home, the MATYSIAK family received the following from the YMCA. It was from Deacon D. Hoagland. Said Hoagland, "It was my good fortune to be for 6 months the YMCA man with the 101st Ammunition Train, 26th Division in France, and thus to know your son, who was a member of the train. When I left the troops, they were just coming out of the line beyond Chateau Thierry, going into a rest camp. I do not know where they are now, but I know they're doing their part well." On the 2nd of October, MATYSIAK was able to write, and said he, "We've been pretty busy at the front, and so we're back for a rest now. So we've been pretty lucky so far. How's everything in Lorain? There's a lot I would like to tell you, but we can't write it, so when we get back, I will have a lot to tell you." On the 6th of October, he was also able to write. He wrote his brother, "It's been a long time since I wrote home, for we didn't have time to write as we were too busy at the front. We're driving the Hun back. They seem to retreat when they see us coming. Just as soon as we get the Hun licked, we will come home, and I don't think it will be too long. Well, Jack, we got a gold service stripe for 6 months of overseas service and have been in several battles. But we've been pretty lucky. So far, I'd like to tell you a lot more, but we can't. So I'll have a lot to say when I get back." A lot to say indeed. This is another image taken during the Meuse River-Argonne forest offensive. This is a German position, an abandoned German position. It's gone from looking like a dense forest really to something that resembles a moonscape. And here is an artist's rendering of the Meuse River-Argonne offensive. It was a brutal, brutal battle. Just to give you an idea, and these are some of the dead from that battle. The French sustained 70,000 casualties during this campaign. The Germans, 100,000. The US, 117,000. 117,000 casualties. 49,000 dead 68,000 wounded. 40% of all U.S. casualties that were sustained during World War I were sustained during this campaign. That's 2 out of every 5. 2 out of every 5 casualties from the United States came from this one particular campaign. Rather brutal. Here we have another picture of MATYSIAK. Notice how straight and he is standing. He is at attention and actually giving us a fine view of a World War I soldier at attention. He was finally able to return stateside on the 11th of January, 1919. So he had just missed the opportunity to be home for Christmas. He would get an honorable discharge on the 13th of March, 1919. I find it interesting that in his letters, he remarked about flowers that he was noticing in bloom. And really, it was told later by family members that the flowers and flower gardens were another one of his lifelong hobbies, along with reading. So it makes sense that he would notice a lot of the flora wherever he went, and that he was sure to write about it. Okay, this is Joseph C. Major. He was born in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. That's a small industrial city just to the east of Pittsburgh. It is located along the Monongahela River. I love saying that word, so anytime I see somebody that was born along that river, I make sure to give its name. He was 22 years old when he entered service, so it's within the average. He's on the high end of it, but he's within the average age range. We don't have his Lorain address. We know that he was living in Lorain, but his particular address did not appear in the official roster. He would enter the service at Cleveland, Ohio on the 2nd of June, 1917. And would deploy overseas in late June of 1918. He would fight in a battle called Ypres, which actually there were several battles of that name that were fought, and he would fight in the one that lasted through much of 1918. Here you can see what the map looks like. There were 108,000 US troops involved, and it was a general engagement that began 18th of August, 1918, and would continue all the way to the signing of the armistice on the 11th of November. You can look at Ypres as a smaller scale Meuse River-Argonne forest offensive. And you can basically get an idea of how the Allies attacked the various places that they were. You can see the American position toward the south, a little bit near Verdun, but particularly they're trying to push this northern salient backward. And it would take them a heck of a long time to do so. US units, again, 108,000 troops deployed. The US units would sustain 2,600 casualties. Here's a training exercise or a drill exercise. This is an American machine gun crew. Officer seems to be looking over things. These are some US troops sleeping. One actually has his helmet off and appears to be smiling for the camera, which is remarkable considering where they are. And it looks like this entrenchment that they're in was dug rather hastily. It's not very deep. Here we have US troops trying to work on restoring a bridge to get across the small river during fighting. Mr. Major would return stateside in April of 1919, so he came back during the spring. He would receive an honorable discharge about a little over 2 weeks later as a sergeant. So he actually did rather well for himself and was actually able to be promoted. And I've included him here because he fought in one of the few battles that Andrew MATYSIAK did not. Okay, this is Elmer Smith. He was born in Cleveland, Ohio, but was living at 2144 Beach Avenue during the Great War period. He was 24 years, 2 months old when he entered service. So again, he's on the older side. He's actually outside of the average. He was older than your typical U.S. soldier. The battles that he fought in, he would enter the army in Lorain, Ohio, and would actually be a part of the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. This battle was commanded by General Armando Diaz. And here's a map showing you where the battle took. This is northern Italy. The large body of water that you see to the right is the Adriatic Sea. So it gives you an idea of about where we are in Italy. And you can see a number of arrows pushing northward. That was all part of the Vittorio Veneto offensive. This offensive began fairly late in the war. It began on the 24th of October, 1918. They were pressing against an Austrian line. What ended up happening was on the 30th of October and on the 3rd of November, the Austro-Hungarian Empire would surrender. These are Allied troops marching into place during the battle. And here are a group of Allied soldiers literally going over the top, leaping out of their advanced trench and going after either an enemy emplacement or just trying to take up positions at another trench or another area that they have to get to. By the 4th of November, there was a ceasefire in effect. Elmer Smith would return stateside in June of 1919 and receive an honorable discharge 10 days later. Okay, this is Roy Stackhouse. Roy was born in Kensington, Ohio. His address was 1527 West 19th Street. And he was 22 years, 4 months old when he entered service. He's just at the outside limit of your average serviceman's age. He entered the Army at Lorain, Ohio on 20th of September, 1917. He would deploy overseas in June, and he would see a number of battles, some of the same battles that Mr. MATYSIAK was in. So I won't go into the detail of the battles again. He participated in Saint-Mihiel, and he was wounded during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. We don't have a date. Mr. Stackhouse stands out as one of Lorain's citizens who was actually wounded in combat. We know that the wound was severe. We don't get any more detail in the official roster. Occasionally, they will go into more detail about a person's wounds or a person's death. But in this case, all we know is that he was wounded severely. He was finally able to return stateside at the very end of August 1919 and would receive an honorable discharge 6 days later. Okay, and this is Lynn Thomas. He was born in Leicester, Ohio. His address was 2704 Reed Avenue. That's one of the larger streets in Lorain. He was 21 years, 5 months old when he entered service. So again, he's on the older side, but he's still well within the average. What can we tell you about him? He would fight in the Aisne-Marne offensive, at Saint-Mihiel, and in the Meuse-Argonne. We know on the 22nd of October, 1918, this would be the Meuse-Argonne, he would be wounded in action and again would be wounded severely. And again, the roster doesn't go into detail as to how severe the wound was. He would return stateside in 1919, and again, 6 days later would receive an honorable discharge. So that's two men that we have who were actually wounded, and wounded severely in action. Wilfred Thompson, his background. He was actually born in Ontario, Listowel, Ontario in Canada. When he lived in Lorain, he lived at 840 Oberlin Avenue. Take a look at how old he is when he enters service. 29 years, 6 months old. He is definitely on the outside of the average and is significantly older than your typical Lorain serviceman. He would enter the service at Lorain on the 20th of September, 1917. He spent much of his time in Texas and Florida training with the aviation sections of the U.S. Army. When he was finally deployed, he was actually part of a horse battalion in an ammunition train. So he was in a while, but apparently was moved out. He would go overseas on the 29th of June, 1918. Sadly, on the 21st of September, 1918, he would die of complications arising from the flu. Remember, there was a tremendous global pandemic that was rocking the world in 1918, 1919 era. And many, many people would die from this. In fact, again, twice as many people died from the flu as died from combat during World War I. My figures that I have here suggest 53,000 U.S. servicemen, 53,000 would die of the flu while serving in the U.S. Army. When you died overseas, or died anywhere actually, a notification was received by a family member. In this particular case, his father, Mr. William Thompson, was notified that his son had in fact passed away. Finally, I want to mention Harold Schwann. Look how young he is. He looks definitely younger than most of the other people that we have seen so far. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He had been born in Middletown, Pennsylvania. When he moved to Lorain, he lived at 1959 East 30th Street. What else can I tell you about the man? Look at this. He was 16 years, 11 months old when he entered service. Not quite 17 years old. He was outside the younger limit that we find for the average U.S. troops. Nevertheless, he was able to enter the Army at Columbus on the 16th of May, and he would deploy overseas on the 18th of July, 1918. What did he do while he was overseas? He was part of Prisoner of War Escort Company 256. He was one of the soldiers that was guarding and moving captured troops during the war and then after the war. He would not return stateside until the 1st of November, 1919, almost a year after the signing of the armistice. And then on the 5th of November, 4 days later, he would get an honorable discharge as a private. So there he is, returned stateside on the 1st of November and receives an honorable discharge. And I can't imagine going into such a conflict, not quite 17. Should you go to Washington, D.C., take a look at Independence Avenue between 17th and 23rd Street. This is a World War I memorial erected in honor of the troops who fought during the war. It was intended originally to commemorate just those veterans who had been living in Washington, D.C., but it has since come to mean a little bit more. It is tended to be regarded more as a national memorial. Just as a reminder that these were kids, some of them kids, I mean, not even 17. And again, average age 17 to 22 years of age. They're awfully young. And they're going overseas and they're fighting in some rather incredible, under some incredible circumstances. So that brings me to the end of the program that I had prepared. I don't know if there are questions or if there's any other interaction required of me, but Caitlin, if you're listening, if you could come back on the screen and direct us. There we are. Yeah. But I thank you very much for the opportunity to share again.
Oh, thank you so much for that presentation. Definitely a lot of work, and it's very apparent, and I really appreciate it. So I have a question. So if you have questions, I see some of you have used the Q&A feature. Go ahead and use that, or the chat feature, whatever you're more comfortable with. If you have questions, I will read them out to Craig. 1 second, I'll make a little. But while we're waiting for people to post their questions, I have one. So earlier, Craig, when we've talked, you said that Lorain makes an excellent case study for studying World War I.
Yes,
and I was wondering if maybe you could comment further on that.
Well, yeah, I'd mentioned earlier that, again, Lorain veterans participated in just about every aspect of the war you could expect them to. They were fighting in just about every unit, type of unit that the U.S. Army had. In the Navy, they served on just about every class of vessel you could care to mention, from small destroyers to research vessels. They also deployed to the big battleships, and battleships that were older and would go overseas to fight, and then newer battleships that had to stay close to home. The British did not have enough, the newer battleships in our Navy had, for example, had oil-fired boilers, and the British didn't have the capacity to handle a large number, so all of our older coal-fired battleships were deployed. So Ernest King, our favorite native son of Lorain, was a staff officer on the USS Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, the Pennsylvania was a modern oil-burning ship, so he had to fight the war stateside. He didn't get to go overseas. Interestingly, again, there were troops in the Coast Guard, and they were, again, they fought in Coast Guard actions. Some were working with sub-chasers. They actually built sub-chasers here on Lake Erie, and many of them were actually deployed by sailing to Chicago, going through the Chicago River, linking up with the Mississippi River, and then they would take the boat literally to the Gulf of Mexico and then to the Atlantic Ocean. So some Lorain veterans got to see a lot of water, got to see the country by river, as it were. But again, and there were, again, a number of Marines who fought in some rather scary campaigns as well. Again, every battle that had U.S. troops involved, there were Lorain citizens there. Any type of aircraft unit you can mention, they were there. So I was really thrilled with that. I was really just amazed at how many of these people there actually were.
Yes, thank you. So we do have some questions from our viewers. Well, first, John Belisario asked if there will be a recording of this available, and to answer everyone, yes, there will be. He also just says, thank you, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And Hilaire Tavener asked, I don't know, Craig, if you remember this gentleman from your research, but Corporal John Danley was the first Lorainite to die in World War I. I don't know if you recall details about him.
I don't recall him off the top of my head. He's probably in my notes. I would have to go research him. Is this something somebody wanted me to send information on or something?
Actually, I could get you, I know her email, so I could connect you to.
Oh, very good.
Yeah,
very good.
I'm sure she would appreciate that.
Okay, very good.
Fran asked, how many British casualties in World War I?
British casualties. Ooh, it's a big number. Let's see if I can pull this up. Around 1.7 million.
Wow.
Literally, it seems like an entire generation died in Western Europe. That's just British casualties. That's 1.7 million. That doesn't even count the French, German, Austro-Hungarian, or Russian troops who died. So yeah, 1.7 million. That's scary.
Wow. John also asked, were these men volunteered or drafted?
Most of them were, well, it's a mixed bag. Some of them volunteered, some of them were drafted. So it's kind of hard to break them down. The roster doesn't really go into that. It does break down those who were regular Army and those who were, I guess they didn't use the term reservists, but they used two other terms. They used National Guard or National Army. Which might suggest that, I don't know how it breaks down. I don't know if you volunteered, if you went right into the regular Army, and I'm not sure. I really couldn't tell you. I could probably break it down as to who was regular Army, who was National Guard, and who was National Army, but I don't know exactly how that figure breaks out. Sorry.
Another question was everyone against the Germans?
Was everyone against the Germans? That would be a tough question to answer. I really don't know. I don't have that kind of information available. Was there a heavy anti-German? There was a heavy anti-German sentiment nationally. Exactly how severe that was here in Lorain, I am not certain. I think there was one case of a Lorainite who left Lorain and was living someplace else, and he actually committed suicide before he could actually deploy. I remember that story. I don't remember if he was German or not, and he would be going back to fight against other Germans. I can't remember what the story was, but I know there was some extenuating circumstances behind that person's deployment.
Yes, I don't remember what nationality he was, but I recall seeing that newspaper
you remember
clipping.
seeing it too? Yeah, okay, yeah.
I do know that there was at least some anti-German sentiment here because they banned German newspapers, and they banned German music except for the classics. They said.
Oh, they spared the classics. So you can barely, you can't really do classical music without German music.
Yeah,
it's a little difficult. It can be done, but it's difficult.
Somebody was, I don't remember what his punishment was, but it made the newspaper that people were offended that a German saloon owner had a picture of the Kaiser on his wall. They were upset about that. That also made it into the paper.
After the war, there were quite a few Germans that would object to him having a picture of the Kaiser. So.
Let's see.
But it would be interesting to go through Lorain papers from the period and see if we could get a sense of the anti-German sentiment. I mean, if you look at the letters of MATYSIAK, he talks about beating the Hun and coming home, but he doesn't really speak of them derisively at all.
Oh,
it would also be interesting to see what Mr. Schwann's thoughts would have been if he'd ever written anything or had a diary or something. It'd be interesting to see, guarding these prisoners of war, what his attitude might have been.
Yes, something else jogged my memory. I recall that there was fear that there would be attacks in Lorain. And so they had guards stationed at railroad crossings, at Cromwell Steel, probably at National or US Steel or National Tube.
That would make sense.
There were like 5 places that they had guards stationed, and Leonard Moore was mayor briefly during World War I, and he was calling for aid from the state, I believe, for additional support to get guards here.
Yeah, I remember I worked at a cable station on Cape Cod. This is, doesn't have anything to do with Lorain, but I remember that actually a U-boat actually surfaced off the coast of Cape Cod and actually shelled the town of Orleans for a period of time. So
wow.
It could happen. The danger was real.
Well, I don't see any additional questions. So I will just thank you again, Craig, for this presentation.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you, everyone who joined us live. If there's any questions that come up, feel free to email me after, and I will pass those on to our speaker. Otherwise, I will say goodbye to everyone. Have a great afternoon.